Erev Tov, good evening. I'm Chazan David Propus, and on behalf of the Board of Trustees, clergy, and staff of Congregation Shaarey Zedek, I would like to welcome you to what will be a stimulating discussion given the challenging times we are in on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and racism on campus and in society. We will be having a conversation between our guest, Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, and Shaarey Zedek's Rabbi Dahlen. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for promoting this event: Hadassah Greater Detroit, National Council of Jewish Women, Michigan Zionist Organization of America, Michigan Region, Volunteers for Israel, Frankel Jewish Academy, and the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Additionally, I would like to thank all the other Jewish organizations that helped promote this important event. This program was developed and made possible by a small group of dedicated community members. Dr. Shufutinsky is the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values. She holds a doctorate in international and multicultural education from the University of San Francisco and an MSW from the University of Southern California. Brandy was a 2021 Scholar in Residence at the Oxford Summer Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. She recently testified before Congress on K-12 anti-Semitism as one of the leading experts on this subject. In addition to Dr. Shufutinsky's professional achievements, she built a strong Jewish family. Her oldest son served in the IDF as a lone soldier. His brother is rapper Westside Gravy, who works for Stand With Us in Jerusalem. See, you brought your fans, look at this. Her two younger children attend Jewish day schools. After the conversation, there will be a half hour for questions from the audience. If you choose to ask a question, please be sure it is short and to the point. Thank you. Rabbi Dahlen, we look forward to your conversation with Dr. Shufutinsky.
Thank you, Chazan Propus. Friends, it is great to be together tonight for this really important conversation. So first, just join me in welcoming Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky. And also, I will reiterate this at the end, but also join me in thanking these individuals, not organizations, individuals who brought this opportunity for conversation together. In the atmosphere that we live in, which is so about teams and tribalism and digging in our heels and being so far away from each other that we're not willing to have the conversation, just know how incredibly honored and blessed I am to be able to be here with Dr. Shufutinsky and with all of you tonight to be able to have tough conversations, because that's what Judaism is, and that's what society is, and that's what living with people is about. So I'm excited for tonight. I have about 8 hours worth of questions. I have to somehow keep that to 1 hour. I will do my best to do so, and of course we'll open it up at the end for you all to ask some questions as well. So first I want to just start, Dr. Shufutinsky, by asking you if you can just give us a little bit of a background of you, your story, and how you got here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, and I really do appreciate being brought out to meet all of the great people that I've been meeting over the past couple of days in Michigan. This is my first trip here, so it's been amazing so far, so good. Thank you. About 6 years ago, I went back to school to get my doctorate in international and multicultural education from the University of San Francisco. And my first semester, I was really stunned and concerned about what I was seeing being taught to future teachers, administrators, and curriculum developers. There seemed to be a bit of an ideological capture of the School of Education, where educators were being told that they had to use this narrow, specific ideology in the classroom. And the results that we are seeing today, I think, are coming out of that ideological capture in our teachers' colleges and our schools of education. So we're seeing this ideology in action on a lot of the university campuses today.
Great. I know that I saw some of our college students walk in, and I also just want to commend them for being part of this conversation, and also just say how crazy it is to be a college student these days. But I think just for the sake of really being clear about everything that we're talking about, knowing that all of us kind of live in these different echo chambers, most of us are not on the ground experiencing what's going on in universities right now. We see the different things that we see from our media that we consume. So if you can kind of break down, I think we're going to zoom in a little bit and then we're going to zoom out to some of the bigger topics. But right now we've seen commencement addresses, we've seen encampments on different college campuses, we've seen protests and marches and everything. What is going on? How did we get here? And what's the situation? What's the reality on the ground?
So I'll be specific in relation to the ideology. There is an oppressor versus oppressed binary that is being used to filter all information through. And we're seeing that play out as far as the anti-Semitism we're seeing on college campuses and in K-12 education, in all honesty. What's happening is that people are being told that this group is labeled oppressed, therefore anything they do is justified or justifiable. And this group is being labeled as an oppressor, so whatever happens to them is deserved. And before October 7th, there were indications of this. I don't know how many people saw or followed the commencement addresses coming out of CUNY, the City University of New York Law School. There were commencement speakers that got on stage and they didn't give a more traditional or normal commencement speech. Instead, they used it to really bash Israel, to bash Zionism, to bash Jews. And part of that, I believe, is because there's been this ideology that's become normalized that in effect, in actuality, what it's doing is it's normalizing anti-Semitism. Because Jews are labeled as the oppressor, Israel is looked at as the ultimate Jewish identity faction state, and therefore whatever happens to Israel, whatever bad thing happens to Israel is deserved, whatever bad thing happens to Jews, it's deserved. And whoever's doing it to them, they're doing it for a reason. So we heard after October 7th a lot of statements like, well, all violence is rooted in oppression. So anytime we see something violent, the reason it happened is because the people that are perpetuating the violence were oppressed. So they're just trying to break free from oppression. And we're seeing that type of rhetoric normalized and accepted and spouted and then put in action on college campuses through things like the encampments, which are a more recent manifestation that only happened over the past couple of months. It didn't happen immediately after October 7th. Other things happened. But during those protests on campus, what happened isn't only genocidal slogans or anti-Semitic slogans. Jewish students and faculty were actually blocked from accessing certain parts of campus. And that was seen by those who believe in this ideology as being just, as being on the right side of history.
So this is 7 hours of my 8 hours questions right here. How did Jews get put into that category? Like that is, it's for me difficult to figure out where in this process of when we look at Jews being one of the most oppressed, marginalized groups throughout history, of how Jews somehow is it just through Israel that somehow when there's Jews have power, whether they have their own nation state or when they have some kind of military force to be reckoned with in the Middle East, that now Jews are fit into that category? Or is there a process that somehow Jews got lumped in with other folks?
I think it's a process, and I think part of that process is when we look at anything like privilege or success as a slur, as being only achieved through ill gain, so only achieved through the exploitation of other people or the exploitation of resources. And then you take a group that's a teeny tiny minority, not just in the world, but in the United States. Jews are a significant minority. And on average, Jews achieve above the mean. So the only reason, if you accept that ideology, that Jews have been able to achieve above the mean is through exploitation, which can then mean that they must have then oppressed other people. There is no other explanation once you believe that ideology. It's a self-fulfilling rabbit hole. You accept this, and that means you have to go along this path, which leads us to, I think, what we're seeing today as far as how Jews are defined. The other part of it is, when the game is the oppression Olympics, and everyone wants to win, then the way to win is to say you're the most oppressed. When my argument is that game shouldn't be played at all.
Right. Yeah, earlier tonight when we were at dinner, we were talking about Dara Horn and her understanding of anti-Semitism, and one of the things that she says pretty brilliantly is anti-Semitism exists different than other forms of racism and bigotry, because in a lot of those forms it's about considering someone as inferior to you, right? You say that someone is lower than you, or not as this, not as smart, not as advanced. And in Judaism, there's this idea that Jews are somehow higher and conniving and sneaky in how they get to where they are. So it's actually punching up, right? It's speaking truth to power, which is, I guess, an older form of reiterating the same kind of thing of oppressed and oppressor. That because this tiny group of people has somehow not only survived, but in some cases done really well for themselves in their survival, there has to be an explanation for it, and that explanation has to be nefarious, right?
Right.
They've exploited people. They've somehow done this because they're powerful.
Right, and that also relies on people accepting the idea that being successful, having privilege is a bad thing. If it were a good thing, then there wouldn't be that version, that form of contemporary anti-Semitism. But all of a sudden, privilege is bad, so you have to apologize for it. Success is only gained through tenets of white supremacy. So if anyone's successful, they should be ashamed of it. They should have to apologize for it.
Okay, so we are making this sound very easy to be able to parse through, yet this ideology and this mentality is not only in schools and in universities, but in prestigious universities. Right? Our perception of our most intelligent students, our most intelligent faculty are propagating this idea that for us, when we say it out loud, seems pretty easy to parse through and see how absurd it is on its face. How does it get to a point where it is so understood that it can thrive at places like Harvard and Columbia?
First of all, no institution, no matter how much prestige it holds, it can fully guard itself against ideological creep. And so we've seen over probably longer, but say the past 10 years, and I spoke about this with a group of people yesterday, or actually earlier today also, this idea where truth doesn't matter because we're in an era of my truth. And when you replace truth with opinion, you're susceptible to dogma taking over, which is, I think, what we've seen in universities. We see it with people who argue about things from Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel, to conversation and argument and debate over girls and women's sports and gender ideology, where people are having a hard time even having the conversation on, well, is there truth? Is there, are there multiple opinions, and can we have a discussion on the best way to address that truth, where people can feel included, can feel like they belong? Those conversations aren't even happening. What's happening in the academy and in universities, higher education, is people who don't go along with ideology and the dogma are silenced. And sometimes the silence is self-silencing because they're worried about being called racist or Islamophobic or transphobic or some other, bad negative label. So they just stop talking and pushing back, or even stop asking questions, which is something that we're seeing students do. There are a lot of students in high school, in college, who know what their professor or what their teacher is saying is false. Or maybe they have a question about it, but they're self-censoring. They're not pushing back, they're not asking the question. They're writing whatever they think the teacher's going to give them an A on, just so they could get through it and move on. So the ideas aren't being challenged. So you have a situation where the most prestigious universities, the most elite colleges in the world are it's just a bunch of groupthink. Nothing is challenged. There's no curiosity, no intellectual curiosity, not much scholarship, not much pushing back against the ideological orthodoxy.
To me, that just betrays the entire idea of higher education, right? Which is, when I was going to school, the idea was, here's some topics that you thought you might know something about. Here's some ways that I can poke some holes in those different theories and different ideas. And I'm not going to tell you my answers, but I'm going to show you that some of the things that you were taught growing up have some issues. And now discuss and figure out, and if you discuss it, you might end up with the same thought and mentality that you had coming in, but you've explored it and you challenged it. And it sounds like we're now arriving in a place, and again, it feels almost like this happened overnight, but I know that can't be the case, right? That it's been, a systematic process of this kind of sweeping in. But now the idea of that intellectual exploration feels gone. I mean, that's the nicest way to put it. It almost feels taboo to even consider it.
I agree. I think that part of that is you can't have a homogenous group of people as far as how they think and expect to get multiple viewpoints.
Right.
So we have ideas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we'll just stick with the diversity part. And the diversity, how it's acting out, isn't diversity of thought. It's not diversity of individuals. It's diversity of color. Diversity of color can be homogenous in thought, and so you're not going to get those questions or ideas or the intellectual curiosity that is required for scholarship.
Interesting. I'm also just thinking that I think that word diversity is supposed to mean a lot of different things, but it has become a pretty narrow focus of what that is, because I also think that in some of these places you're not looking at economic diversity, you're not looking at the backgrounds of different experiences as far as diversity, you're quite literally looking at just the color of someone's skin or the box that they can check off to represent the diversity, which doesn't lead to conversation, right? So I'm wondering, this is a big question, but we can start zooming out a little bit now. How do we fix this? I think these different protests and these encampments and the publicity they're getting, we are part of outrage culture, right? Where we want to get upset, so the things that get us upset take up a lot of airtime. But poll after poll is telling us that this is a minority opinion. Like these encampments are not the voice of America. The great majority of Americans aren't thinking this way. So how do we all come to this moment and say, what's happening, and start doing something about it?
So a couple of things. It's not the minority of campus. There was a huge story about these students who walked out when Jerry Seinfeld was being presented with an honorary degree. The full story is this was a graduation ceremony with, I believe, 7,000 students, and 30 walked out. But it made the protests appear bigger than they actually were. So great, I take great comfort to know that most kids who went to graduation actually wanted to participate in their graduation and celebrate such a big achievement. However, just because it's a minority doesn't make it dangerous, because we're seeing that minority opinion, fringe extremist opinion, is driving many policies. Right? So what we can do about it is try to stop that and counter it with better policies, with making sure that the people that are making policies and enforcing them know that the vast majority of us will reject those policies and we are going to present something different and better. And one thing that we're seeing on the universities, a couple of things. We're seeing funders say, we're not going to give you money anymore. Like you've lost control of the campus. This fringe group is running the campus. The students aren't safe. Bigotry is running rampant. We're not going to fund you anymore. Good. However, we're seeing also university presidents capitulating to the mob. So they're giving in to this list of demands from all of these people, these protesters, and some of the demands themselves potentially violate the law, university policy, civil rights legislation. Well, there has to be a counter to that. Where is the list of demands from the Jewish students and parents and alumni and funders and professors? There's a lot of no, you can't do that, no, ban that, no, stop that, not enough, do this instead. And I think we need to do more of the do this instead.
This is something that Rabbi Starr and I talked about a while ago. I can't even remember the context, but I think one of the things that's so intimidating about that is it also plays into the exact stereotypes and the same conspiracy theories that these students are perpetuating to say these Jews have so much power and whatnot, that when Jews organize and try to say stop this, then it displays that idea of Jews coming together and having power, right? So I think there's also a form of intimidation there of saying, don't do what you are going to do because it'll just back up what we're saying.
But only if you accept that having power is bad.
Right. What
other group of people say, no, we want to appear weak? I reject the whole idea that power is bad. If that's a stereotype, it's a stereotype. I'm not going to give in and capitulate to the stereotype to my own demise.
Right.
And in some cases, good. Let them think we're powerful. Great. Like the idea that that is a bad thing is accepting an ideology that is going that has been, not even going to be, it's been harmful to the Jewish community in the United States. I don't see, and I look at this sometimes in terms of the military. What military, when they're defending their people, want to appear weak just so they don't appear powerful? That's not how you win a war or a battle. And this is here a bit of a PR war. And you fight a war with all of the power and strength that you have at your disposal.
Right, but the war is different now, whereas the weaker you appear, the more power you get, because it's the oppression Olympic model, right? Of saying, I'm actually really beat down and really vulnerable, and vulnerability gets sympathy, and sympathy is what power is.
But it doesn't get sympathy for Jews.
Right.
Like, it's not getting sympathy for Jews. I understand what you're saying, and
Yeah.
a lot of people are concerned about that. And it's not that it's a nonsense concern. I understand it. It makes sense. But it doesn't work for Jews in America. It never has, and I don't believe it will.
Because of the Dara Horn point.
Yeah.
That it feels like it's not actually, that there's something nefarious and malicious going on, so the sympathy even is part of that, right? Asking for sympathy is just part of the plan, right?
Maybe it's part of the plan. I'm not sure. I just think that there's a level of dehumanization of Jewish people that there isn't sympathy for Jews. Right. This is something that we've seen as far as the conversation about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Should we say we need to get rid of it? It's fueling a lot of anti-Semitic ideology. It's fueling a lot of anti-Americanism. Or should we just make sure Jews are included because Jews have been oppressed? Well, in the context of contemporary anti-Semitism, Jews don't get sympathy for having been oppressed. So participating in it isn't going to lessen anti-Semitism.
Right, because Jews in this context are lumped in as white oppressors within that system. And
if Jews are seen as weak or they've been oppressed with this ideology, the view is that we deserve it.
Right. Right, because of, okay. It's so absurd. I'm trying to think about that within the context. Just feels that we're speaking, it's mishpacha here, right? But we're speaking and saying, like, how does that mentality work? And I think it's really hard for us to understand it as being like, what, can't you see the Holocaust literature you grew up studying, or any examples of the rampant anti-Semitism that was taking place years ago when Jews were getting beat up and killed and shot in New York, and then now what's going on, and it just feels like those don't count. And it's hard for me to understand how that doesn't count, or how it doesn't enter into the imagination of someone to be like, this seems bad. This seems like a disproportionate thing that is happening to these people.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I don't think that it's easy to understand. It's sure not easy to accept. But it is what we're seeing. It's what we're seeing play out right in front of us. And I think that ignoring it or pretending it's not playing out isn't going to help. It is what's happening. The anti-Semitism that we're seeing today, contemporary anti-Semitism, isn't for the most part coming from far-right neo-Nazis.
Right.
So before we... Oh, cute.
That's the best noise.
I love it.
That's a great noise.
So before we even get to how do we address it, we have to acknowledge where it's coming from.
Right.
And we have to be able to identify where it's coming from and how it's manifesting. And once we're able to do that, then we can make a plan on how to counter it. But what's happening right now is, for a large part, like a vast majority, the conversations of what type of anti-Semitism is this, what ideology is fueling it, those conversations aren't happening. Those questions aren't being asked and answered.
Okay. So part of that zooming out that we were talking about is looking at how this gets into the university settings in general. And I think we take a step back and look that it's there because it's also in our lower schools, in K through 12. And it's, we were talking earlier too about how all these, the kind of standards of what we used to remember in school as far as reading comprehension and phonics and everything else has taken a back seat to some of these different ideas of social construction and creating whatever kind of social ideas we have. So how did we get there? How long has that been something that's been in our schools? And what's the trajectory of it like right now?
So I think, where I look at the roots of what we're seeing today traces back to the 1960s, where there was a capture of institutions of higher education by people that were radical. So the power movements, whether it was the Black Power movement or the Brown Pride movement or the Red Power movement, where there was this push for third world liberation, which is the global South, the Black and brown people rising up and overtaking the global North who were labeled the white oppressors, and that struggle. That captured universities and higher education in the 1960s. A lot of it was fueled during the Cold War by the Soviet Union through money and ideology and a lot of other things that it will take kind of a long time to go through. And we're seeing the results of that. So the academy, higher education, became more and more and more to the left, and professors and faculty who were more conservative thinkers were pushed out. Many of them started a bunch of the think tanks that we have today so that they could continue research and education, but in a think tank mode. And so at the university level, you have a very homogenous group of thinkers who have pushed theories from decolonial theory to liberation theory to things like Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is like a Bible in most schools of education, which teach that school and education should be political. Everything is political. Schools should be activist-oriented. The birth of the scholar activist. Schools should be used to teach the next generations to be revolutionaries. And we see these community nonprofit organizations pop up to provide that type of curriculum development and teacher training in the K-12 realm.
I think I look at some of this and the gut instinct is that you want to say, look what you're doing to our schools, look what you're doing to our kids. And yet I also think that I'm a rabbi, I'm supposed to come from a place of like compassion and dan l'chafsut, of giving people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that the great majority of folks might not even be aware of some of the harm that's happening, right? Mm-hmm. Where they see themselves as responding to questions or historical context, especially in this country, and saying, we've messed up a lot, right? And some of these times that we have really let down marginalized communities and people of color, and there feels like a penance that comes from doing this. So how do we make it right without being able to say, this isn't making it right, right? So I guess there's a couple questions there, one of which is how do we just zoom out to let folks see that this isn't working in the way that either they think it's going to work or hope that it works, again with the giving them the benefit of the doubt for the majority of folks here, and also say, like, we can find a different way of doing this.
I think raising awareness to what's actually happening, which is occurring. There was a news article that came out today that was talking about the low level of scholarship for medical students coming out of UCLA Medical School, how much they don't know. What we're gonna see, unfortunately, is the result of what happens when you don't teach students the things they're supposed to learn. And whether that's from engineers that are not able to build the things they should be able to build, or whether that's physicians making medical mistakes that they wouldn't have made had they been educated the right way. So I think that we're maybe even already seeing some of that. Like the result's gonna, where the proof is in the pudding. It's gonna be in what happens where people aren't able to do the jobs that they should be able to do because they were supposed to have been educated in that field. Now, how we pivot away is the idea that we can talk about, of course, America's not been a perfect country, but my question is which one has?
Right.
So what's the expectation? Is there a way to say, of course, there has been racism, there's actually been institutionalized racism in the United States through Jim Crow or different types of exclusionary acts? We know this already. We've also had civil rights movement. And today, legally, those types of discriminatory practices are illegal by law in the United States. That doesn't mean that there will never be racism again.
Right.
Humans are fallible. There will be racists and anti-Semites and misogynists and the like. That's just going to be. There isn't a program that we can create or institute that's going to get rid of every racist.
Right.
So it's coming from a position of reality and a position of realistic expectations. The idea that because the United States has previously done bad things to these different groups of people means that the United States as a country could never do anything good or is forever permanently stained is also not true.
Right.
Because the US isn't different from other countries as far as that's concerned. Every country has made mistakes because it's run by people and people are fallible. So it's really coming from the position of realism, and then also looking at, okay, so people say we need to put forward these equity DEI policies to make up for. And my question always goes to, well, what's the result? Because I'm not seeing an improvement. I'm not seeing an improvement in educational outcomes because the bar has been either lowered or completely erased. I'm not seeing more kids able to read or able to compute or able to even know the civics they should know as citizens of the United States of America. So those policies and practices aren't working. We actually know in the field of education, at least, what works because we've done it before. We've had people who couldn't read learn how to read. We've had people who couldn't compute learn how to do mathematics. The idea that if we tie every unequal outcome to racism, so we have to do all of these things to address racism, but we're not teaching kids to count, well, the result's going to be failure, which is what we're seeing in our school system today.
But it also doesn't seem like that's the goal, necessarily, is to see the results of kids reading better or having higher test scores. It seems like the idea is more of a social goal of saying, don't be racist, don't be hateful, don't be bigoted, and in the process, we're going to kind of divide up everyone into camps, and not understanding that divisiveness, that tribalism, by its definition, by the very definition of dividing people up, creates tension and hostility and racism and divisiveness. So, it's just one of these things that shocks me of like, how can this be the goal and it's counterintuitive to the goal itself?
I mean, I think that with that, you're probably right. For some people, it isn't the goal. The goal isn't to improve standards. Looking at what programs are being put in place or taken away in the K-12 education system today, the KKK couldn't have brought forward a better program to disenfranchise Black American citizens than what's happening. The level of illiteracy amongst Black Americans is cultural genocide, and it's being done in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's being done in the name of this is for the kids. I mean, taking away somebody's ability to read takes away their ability to function fully as a citizen in this country, to access what they should have access to. That's why people who were enslaved weren't allowed to learn to read. That's why it was a crime punishable by death or mutilation. And now we're seeing that same thing happen in our K-12 system, taxpayer funded, in 2024.
I'm actually speechless. As a rabbi, that doesn't happen very frequently. But I think it's profound, right? To, again, going back to this idea that I think a lot of people here think they're doing good and are trying to, I'm speaking a lot from personal experiences here, of knowing that when I was growing up, what we were taught was, we don't see color. You're supposed to be colorblind, right? That was the message that we were all raised with. And then we realized that was also terrible because it actually made us all have to shift into a white Christian milieu, which was the great majority of the country, and everyone else's culture and different experiences was just supposed to be pushed to the side because we don't see color. We've overcorrected that by saying now we only see color, and we erase people's individuality and their individual experiences, and we don't talk about people by their name or their passions or their loves or their hobbies, but we talk about people based on their cultural background and what boxes they can check off. And that also is incredibly dehumanizing. So I think we're constantly searching for the character and the soul of who we are supposed to be, and we keep going to these different extremes without trying to say, hold on, how can we understand that all of us are humans and we're all created in God's image and there's value and beauty and worth to every single person, that people's backgrounds and cultural backgrounds should be seen and celebrated and also not hyper-focused on so that we can all work together and do different things. We're losing that in the process, and I'm worried that now we all feel so tribalized that we are not allowed to speak out on anything that's not our own experience, that even trying to do so reiterates an idea of oppressor and oppressed, because only the oppressor could actually look at someone's culture and think that, oh, I'm going to take that or be interested in it, even without claiming it to be theirs. And so the safest place to be is alone and siloed, which is the most dangerous thing for humans, is to be alone and siloed. Because how we all work is by being able to come together and ask questions. So how can we get to a place where we're learning about one another without being terrified of saying the wrong thing, without being terrified of one word or one sentence that you say has now pushed you to the sidelines where you are now ostracized and labeled some terrible whatever, and uphold and promote an idea of saying, I'm curious.
So the last part, we can do that through courage and grace, which I'll come back to, but first I'm going to disagree with a rabbi on a bima. Forgive me.
That's cool.
It's
the first time that's ever happened here.
I disagree that color blindness means we're accepting white Christian American culture. Dr. King called for color blindness. And it's not a term that I necessarily like to use because I believe it gets misunderstood. When I was in school, in 6th grade, I had a wonderful teacher. And she would describe America not like a melting pot, but like a mosaic, to where all of these different pieces make a beautiful picture. And so that's where I think, yes, we can acknowledge and hold on to our own separate cultural identities and heritages, and together we make this beautiful picture. And that's actually, the motto of the United States, E pluribus unum. So I don't think that color blindness means I don't see color, so I can't tell that you're not a black woman. I think it should mean that means I'm not going to judge you as less than because you're not the same as me. And the term, I think, is a little bit flawed now because people think it means I don't see color, which means I don't see, I'm completely blind to your difference in cultural individuality. And that should not be a goal. I think that we can acknowledge that we have commonalities and we have differences. And that shouldn't be why we treat people better or worse. It should be based on someone's character and your own character. But I think through courage and grace, the courage to ask the questions even under threat of being called a name and labeled something horrific, and grace that if somebody asks you a question that you actually may find offensive, be able to answer it without actually taking offense, to think they may actually be genuinely curious.
Right.
Which happens on better days than worse.
Yeah. I think that is also a key part of this, right? Is we talked about this halakha concept of dan l'chavzut, of giving people the benefit of the doubt. We're not taught that anymore. We're taught that if someone is asking something that, it's jargon, right, of aggression and microaggressions and something else, that if someone asks you something and you are offended by it, it has to be because it was meant to be offensive, right? You have hurt me because you wanted to do that, and now I feel unsafe, and you are now in a position where you are hurting me, and I am going to disengage. Rather than saying, the way that you just said that kind of proves to me that you might not know a lot about me, so let me tell you something about me, and hope, and going off the benefit of the doubt that you're coming from a place of genuine curiosity. Again, I think it's the most dangerous part of this is that the inability to ask questions is not only just as a Jew, the most anathema thing in the world to me, right? Because that is the heart of who we are as people, is to ask questions, including hard questions and questions that might be embarrassing and show our own vulnerability in being able to have the courage to ask them, as saying that those questions are now taboo and forbidden. I think that the big place that we have to get to, and again, I think this is much bigger than just our campuses and our schools and our universities, is being able to find a place of how do we start normalizing that conversation in a world that is working against us in normalizing that part of conversation.
One of the ways of doing that is getting together, like we've been getting together at least the past couple of days that I've been here in Michigan. And I know people are doing it all over the country. People are getting together and having conversations. I don't think that it's normal to not ask questions. I think that that's what's getting a lot of attention right now. And so there is an idea of like outsized influence of what the fringe is doing and engaging in. And that can then impact our perception of how things really are and how bad they are, which I don't think that they're that bad. I'm not hopeless that, we're done for and doomed. I think that there are steps that can be taken to improve on things that we were already improving on, but that actually requires people to engage.
Right.
It does. The things don't get done in a democracy by themselves. People have to exercise their responsibility as citizens to engage.
So talk a little bit about that hope and that optimism that you have, and about the engagement work that is happening. You mentioned this earlier too. You're not pessimistic. You're not in a place of being like.
I mean, about some stuff.
Okay. Okay.
Not this.
Well, tell me about some of the things you are pessimistic about, and tell me some of the things that you are seeing improvement on right now.
I mean, I think that we've been seeing people, especially since there's a lot of attention on the post-October 7th. I'm going to go before that. When schools went online during COVID and parents became aware of what their kids were being taught or not being taught, we saw a groundswell of parents across the country saying, wait. We want something different. We want to engage our school boards and be part of the process. That needs to continue in a healthy, respectful, democratic way. That's what we're supposed to do. There was pushback. I mean, there are school boards still that will only hold their meetings on Zoom because the engagement is not something they want. In some instances, because it did get out of hand and violent, but in many instances because they don't want the engagement. Right. But I mean, part of it is continuing that. I say this all of the time. Most Americans graduate high school and never step foot back into another high school unless they're going to one of their kids' parent-teacher conferences. So they don't know what's happening in the largest institution in our country. I've said it many times, I'll say it again over the past couple of days. There are upwards of 54 million Americans in public schools today. Out of what do we have, a population, 330 some million?
Yeah.
That's arguably the largest institution in the United States, at least for future generations. And there's almost zero engagement from the overall public, the taxpayers that are funding that institution. We need to be more engaged. Not just about what a school district is doing wrong, but what they're doing right, and with answers and suggestions on other things that they can do better for our kids, for our future. So engagement is a big part of it. We live in a democracy. We live in a participatory democracy. It's not going to fix itself. Citizens have to do what the responsibility, what comes with the responsibility of citizenship.
Right. And some of the things you're pessimistic on?
It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be fast. It would be easier to get disheartened and be pessimistic and say, forget it, it's too big of a problem, it's unsolvable, the teachers' union's too powerful, our school district is too either blue or too red, I'm not going to be able to have an impact. It's easier just to do that. It's not going to be easy. And seeing citizens participate is right now, okay, people are very active. Let's see if it lasts.
Yeah. One of those questions about what we can do, this is a question that we talked about a little bit earlier, but I wanted to kind of circle back to it, is going back to our universities and our students who are at university. I think a lot of parents and grandparents and parents of 4-year-olds and babies, like myself right now, are already thinking, in the wake of some of these schools' decisions that they've made in the past few months, how can I ever send my kid to this school? And yet also one of those questions comes back as, does change come because we don't send kids to school? Does change come because our kids go to school and better those schools? Or is there a reckoning that takes place outside of those universities that say you are going to lose our students, the money that comes from their tuition dollars? What is the route that we go down in this current moment?
All of the above. It really depends on the school. I mentioned earlier at dinner, I'm not going to pay to send my child to a school where they're going to be attacked. They're not going to get my money for somebody to abuse my child. In some places, they're fixable. You have administrations that, if they hear from us, they will do better. But they have to hear from us, so in order to hear from us, we have to be there. And you have some institutions that deserve our tuition dollars, and they deserve the brightest minds from American Jewish students to build up their reputation.
To kind of break apart what we've perceived in the past as being this hierarchy of universities, and saying some schools are actually doing this in the model that's supposed to be done, and they deserve that prestige and our students and our brightest students going there and lifting up that reputation as well.
Evolve or die. The Ivy League institutions have a reputation because they were producing a superior product. They're not necessarily producing that product anymore. So maybe another institution will.
Right. And we're specifically talking about product. These are businesses, right? Which comes back to this question of when you're spending $50,000 per semester at some of these institutions, the money talks, right? Or the decision to not spend money, or also to be able to write and talk to these administrations and say, I'm spending a lot of my money here. I get a say in what happens here, right?
At least a partial say, at least to say, it doesn't mean that because I'm paying tuition, I get to run the show and all the rest of it. It comes into, when I'm talking about product, I'm talking about knowledge. I'm sure you've seen the social media clips of people going and talking to students, and they're asking them which river, which sea.
Right.
They're asking them, can you point out Israel on a map? These are students that are going to universities that are tens of thousands of dollars in tuition a year, and they don't know basic geography. So what's the product they're producing? Is it worth tens of thousands of dollars a semester or a year of tuition?
Right. I think that's some of the troubling things that we've seen is not just the blatant hate that comes with it. There's the anger and the violence that comes with this, but then pressed, the conviction, even with the lack of knowledge, which I think is also just a staple of our time right now, is people thinking that they speak on topics as experts when they often know little to nothing about these things.
When my truth carries just as much weight as the truth,
right.
You don't need to know
matter.
Anything. Right.
Who cares more? Who has the more emotion attached to it? Right. I asked about the pessimism. I want to open up to questions, but before we open up to questions, I want to know about the hope. What is going well right now? Where are we starting to course correct? Where are the things that you are seeing that there's differences and changes taking place?
So specifically to anti-Semitism, the amount of engagement from the American Jewish community and speaking up and speaking out against the anti-Semitism we're seeing right now is amazing. The fact that people are here and we're having conversation, and the conversations that I've had over the past few days in Michigan and that I'm having in other areas in the whole country is amazing. The amount of Jews and Israelis from around the world who on October 8th were scrambling to get on a plane to go back to Israel is amazing, and it's unprecedented. That gives me hope. The Jewish students that are on campus now, they're saying, you're not going to bully me. You're not going to make me shut up. You're not going to make me tuck in my Magen David. I'm going to come here with my Israeli flag, chanting Am Yisrael Hai, and I'm going to keep doing it regardless. The parents and family members of people who are still held captive in Gaza, I can only imagine I'd be curled up in a ball for the past 8 months in the corner somewhere. And they're getting up every day and going and making sure their voices are heard and their loved ones' pictures are there. The family members of those girls that just released that video, that made the decision to release it to the world of their daughters in the most horrific conditions imaginable for a parent. And they did it because they know that in order to keep momentum behind our people, to humanize what was done and what's continuing to be done to our people, gives me hope that we're not saying, I give up. That there's knowledge and awareness of who Jewish people are, and even as a minority, even with the whole world stacked against us, that we're not saying, oh, well, we give up. We're still saying, Am Yisrael Hai. Gives me hope.
Beautiful. Everyone, if you can join me in one more time thanking Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky for being here.
Thank
you. We're going to open it up to some questions now. How we're going to do this is we have 2 microphones. If you can line up, if you have a question at either mic, and we're going to have some of our volunteers help moderate. Listen, we are in a Jewish space, so I'm allowed to say what I'm about to say. Please keep it short, to the point, and have it end with a question mark, please.
Thank you for all your remarks and your insights, and thank you for coming to Michigan. Could you speak a little bit about the Could you speak a little bit about the ethnic curriculum that's going on in the K to 12, and especially we've seen it in California, and what that means for the anti-Semitism and what it's doing for our Jewish students?
Yeah, so in California now, ethnic studies is a mandatory high school graduation requirement for all of the public and charter school students. What's happened is the academics that we were speaking about before, who follow radical ideology that is neo-Marxist and anti-Semitic, have now institutionalized anti-Semitism through ethnic studies in the state of California and beyond. They are teaching an ideology that Israel is a settler colonial state. They have an entire curriculum called Teach Palestine. It's being elevated through organizations like the Zen Education Project and Rethinking Schools. They formed a coalition for liberated ethnic studies, and they have contracts that are paying them hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars in different school districts. One of those school districts is Berkeley Unified, whose superintendent was called to testify before the House Committee on Education and Workforce on May 8th because of the rampant anti-Semitism that's happening in the district and how it's not being addressed by district administrators. So what's happened is because this curriculum is now mandatory in the state of California, you have textbook makers and teacher professional development organizations trying to get it mandated in other states and other districts. Boston already has a mandate. Minneapolis already, actually the state of Minnesota just made ethnic studies mandatory. And other states are bringing in the same ideology, just calling it something else. This isn't just happening in blue states, it's happening in states with Republican governors and Republican school boards because there's that ideological capture. And the reason why even though this is coming out of California and it's mainly centered in California, why it's important to people across the country is because California is the most populous state in the nation. Textbook manufacturers develop textbooks and curriculum according to what comes out of California.
Thank you.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, I'm very active in the interfaith movement here in the Detroit area, and there is a faith-based council that has been appointed to the Detroit Public Schools to offer volunteer to each of the public schools. What has been your impression of working with interfaith leaders to counter this kind of anti-Semitism? My own personal experience has been that the Muslim women have been very sympathetic towards the Jewish position, but not the Muslim men. But I'd like to hear from you.
So I think interfaith work is important, but I think it also can lead to things that are damaging, and I will give an example. What we've seen is, you've seen, I'm sure, plenty of statements that are condemning anti-Semitism, and notice that it's always attached with "and Islamophobia," or "and all types of hate." So what it does, if all we do is interfaith work, is it minimizes Jewish people just into a religious group. Anti-Semitism is not a religious-based hate. Anti-Semitism is a hatred for Jews, all Jews. One of the reasons I think that not just you, many others see that there isn't necessarily the same type of solidarity or allyship with a lot of the men is because a lot of the partners coming from the Muslim community are imams who are radicalized. So people that hold more moderate views, Muslims that hold more moderate views, aren't actually welcomed into the interfaith world to participate. They actually get shunned. A lot of the imams will refuse to work with more moderate Muslim groups. They say, no, I'm not going to join with you, with this rabbi or with this Catholic priest if you include this Muslim group, because they don't align with them ideologically.
First of all, thank you. I got to talk to our distinguished guest this afternoon as well. So there's a question I didn't get a chance to ask you before, so I came back to ask you now. It's actually apropos just to what you were saying. So first of all, I would say I agree with most of what you say. Of for sure, Mrs. Nelson. My 8th grade English teacher just told me to slow down. I will slow down, and I will make sure I speak grammatically perfect. Yeah, I wouldn't be me without her. So I live and I work in the world of college campuses. I work in the world of Jewish studies. So those of us who are Jewish studies academics, here's the conundrum we have, and maybe you can suggest a way through or a solution to this conundrum. We recognize the problem of ethnic studies and DEI and the direction that it's gone. That pretty much is clear. But at the same time, doing away with it is not an entirely viable option, because the simple fact is, without diversity, there would be no Jewish studies, and without ethnic studies, there would be no Jewish studies, because Jewish studies is an example of ethnic studies. So how do we fix DEI, and how do we fix ethnic studies if we start from the premise that doing away with it would be detrimental to Jewish studies?
Great question. So one, I think that, I'm sorry, that was the best thing. One of the things is I don't think that Jewish studies has to be part of ethnic studies. I'm a fan of history. And when you actually teach real history, you cover all people. Taking a studies lens is much different from taking a historical lens. Ethnic studies wouldn't include Jewish studies the way it's been manifesting today, because ethnic studies is dependent upon an ideology that is to tell the story of the oppressed, and Jews aren't considered oppressed. So it would actually erase Jewish studies, how it's operationalizing today. And as far as fixing DEI, part of the problem is the goal. What's the goal of DEI? Anyone?
I'm not entirely sure of myself. I was hoping you could tell me.
No, right, and so
But the diversity part is to make possible, and the reason an emphasis on multiculturalism and pluralism was beneficial to Jewish studies is before those ideas were prevalent, there were no Jewish studies at universities. And really until the end of the 1940s, if you wanted to study Jewish studies, which is only history, it's also literature and philosophy and other things as well, you had to go to a rabbinical seminary to do it. Brandeis was the first place to do it. And the reason it's possible is because in the last, 75 years, well, since Horst Callen, there's been a greater emphasis on pluralism, multiculturalism, and diversity in the curriculum, without which there would be no Jewish studies. So even if you don't want to technically call it ethnic studies, we need the mindset of not simply teaching one version of a much more diverse and inclusive way to teach a whole variety of things. So how do we do that? I mean, we still need to do that.
Yes,
So
I agree. So how we do it is by not tying it to the oppression studies. Right now, ethnic studies and DEI are just manifestations of oppression studies. If we actually want to talk about multiculturalism or pluralism, 100% on board. We live in the United States of America. We're a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multicultural society. But ethnic studies activists say ethnic studies is not multiculturalism. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, it's really looking at, okay, what's the goal? If the goal is to actually bring in diversity, and not just diversity of skin color, but true diversity of individuals, I'm all on board. That's not what we're seeing.
Well, thank you very much for all you've said this evening. So I come from a little different place. I'm not Jewish. I'm an evangelical Christian, very much a Zionist and supportive of the Jewish people. And I speak in churches quite often and speak to Christians about Israel and the Jewish people. And one of the questions I get all of the time is, we hate the anti-Semitism, we hate the anti-Zionism, but what can we do at a very practical, actionable level to help the Jewish community? Do you have any suggestions that I might take back to some of those Christians?
I would say that, first of all, thank you. Thank you for coming, and your daughter's very cute. Thank you. I would say that the thing that you do is the same thing I would tell Jewish people. You get involved. You support policies and people that aren't abiding by anti-Semitism, that aren't discriminating. And you do that the same way, you participate the same way I say to anyone that's here and elsewhere that's Jewish, is you stay involved and get involved, be aware of what's happening. Because again, these ideas, the DEI policies, the ethnic studies curriculum, yes, they're fueling anti-Semitism, but that's not all they're fueling. You're fueling a liberalism, which impacts all of us. Thank you.
Hi. My question is, oops, okay, much better, thank you. My question is a little more pragmatic. I have a sick feeling in my stomach that our leadership, the Jewish leadership of all the organizations, that they're willfully asleep, or they're willfully not alerting, have not been alerting the community. And my question to you is, do you think that we need to start looking internally and thinking, do we need a different leadership? Do we need a different approach in our organizations? Because some of them have been existing for so long with the charter of dealing with anti-Semitism, and if they were a private business, that'd be the results. That'd be out of business a long time ago.
That's a tough one. It's a tough question, and it's one that I hear often. I obviously work for an organization, so I'm going to say support us. I am. But I am also going to say that you don't stay aligned with any organization that isn't serving your interest. Period. You try to talk to them, maybe, and see if they, hey, you're not serving our interest, you're missing these things. See if they're like, ooh, we missed it. People are fallible. I don't think, I'm being realistic. People should be allowed to make a mistake and pivot. If they're not pivoting, maybe you do.
Hi, it's not a question. I want to say something. I admire the Roman, what they said. If you want to live in peace, prepare for war. If you are weak, you are doomed. If you are strong and you have deterrence, people will know what will be the consequences if they mess with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I too am not a Jew, but I share your struggles, and I share the issues that the Jewish people face today. I'm a retired academic, and so I've seen what's been going on in university campuses since I retired in 2012. My question for you deals with the issue of children as change agents. Now, I go to our Farmington School Board with my friend Huge and Bill, and we are highly frustrated. They're dying on the altar of DEI. Now, my question, and somebody else raised this, is where should we, I say we as Christians, you as Jews, send our children? If we send them to the public schools, I have grandchildren, 3rd grade, 2nd grade, preschool. Do I send them to the schools and expect them to be change agents? Do you send your children to the schools to be change agents? What is a reasonable strategy? Because that's an issue that we discuss with my wife, we discuss with our son and daughter-in-law about the future of our children. What will happen to them? What will happen to your children if we do that? And what happens if we withdraw? It's a dilemma, and I would appreciate your insights.
Thank you. It is a dilemma. So I'm a social worker. I'm a social worker. The parentification of children is child abuse. It is not the responsibility of children to do any sort of change. It's not the responsibility of children to be revolutionaries. It's not the responsibility of children to be activists. It's the responsibility of children to be children and hopefully listen to their parents and grandparents. So I think the idea that schools are being used to do that is a form of child abuse, and we need to talk about that. We're denying our children their future. They're illiterate, they're innumerate, and their civic scores are even worse than that in most districts, at least districts that I've looked at. So in the state of California, 87% of Black American students do not meet grade level for reading, and it's about the same for math. It's even worse for civics. We're robbing them, expecting them to be the next generation of revolutionaries or activists or scholar activists or whatever the term of the day is. And that's a form of child abuse. Now, where I send my kids is going to be the place where I can make sure that they're going to get the education that they deserve. And if that changes and I'm unable to have a positive impact, then they're not going to be attending that school anymore. And we've moved them. Many, 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 many parents are homeschooling because of just that, and many more can't. And so this question is coming up. The one thing that is interesting that we don't see on any ballot is any form of school choice. Polling data shows upwards of 70% of Black American parents believe in some form of school choice. But when you hear talking points, we hear that things like school choice are tenets of white supremacy. Interesting. So upwards of 70% of Black American parents then are white supremacists. You put your kids in the best possible place you can, and then at home, which is the best school and the first school, you do what you can.
Good evening. The Wall Street Journal has reported that the capital of Hamas is Dearborn, Michigan. And by the way, Dearborn is just 10 miles or so away from here. How do us, and many people in Dearborn were celebrating with joy October 7th. How do us, Detroit Jewish community, handle that with our neighbors so much supporting Hamas?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I honestly think that being here would be very difficult, and it's easy for me. I'm a retired Navy wife. I would move. I've moved before. But that's not possible, and that's actually that's not a fair thing to ask people to do. And with what's happening in Dearborn and in Michigan as a whole, I mean, you vote in who you can vote in that would combat that. We're a nation of laws and a nation of institutions, and we have to actually engage and use those laws and institutions to combat it. Unfortunately, I think one thing that we're seeing in the United States, both in the organizational world and just amongst Jewish Americans as a whole, is the fight against anti-Semitism is partisan. It can't be. We can't be afraid to support a policy because somebody of an opposite political party than ours proposed it. We can't be afraid to vote for somebody of a different political party, but just because they're of that different political party, but all of their policies align with protecting our community. We're not doing that, and we're paying the cost for it.
I would also say that one of the things that we, again, in our outrage culture, is that we are told to see our enemies, and we are pointed at one another that we should always be working against one another. I think we owe it to ourselves to see that there are non-Jewish brothers and sisters who are here in this room supporting us. And though we might not see it in the Wall Street Journal or in other places, there are brothers and sisters in Dearborn that support us and have reached out since October 7th as well. We can't ignore the people who see us, just as we would never expect them to ignore us when we reach out to them. We can't do it alone. We shouldn't do it alone.
A quick two-part question. Thank you. That way. Okay. To what extent do you feel that anti-Semitism in this country is a result of latent anti-Semitism emerging versus a new crop of anti-Semites? That's number one. And number two, when the war ends in Gaza, hopefully, I don't know how it can end well, but when it ends, what's going to happen with anti-Semitism in our country? Will it abate, or will it just continue at the levels we're at because it's convenient, it's already there?
So I don't think that any anti-Semitism is new. I think we're seeing an echo of two types of old anti-Semitism. I think that contemporary anti-Semitism is being fueled by neo-Marxism and Islamists. Not Muslims, Islamists. There's a difference. And we're not addressing it on that level. We're acting like it's anti-Semitism that's coming from the far right or neo-Nazis, which is there, and I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think when the war ends, the anti-Semitism is probably going to look like it did before October 7th, which wasn't gone away. You can, look at BDS, look at the Women's March, look at the BLM movement and the tenets that are on there that were anti-Semitic. Those all existed pre-October 7th. We're seeing now more people get elected into positions of power who hold views that are not only anti-Semitic, but they're illiberal and anti-American. I don't think that that's going to just go away when the war ends, unfortunately. I think that there are things that we can do to address it. Everybody who's a citizen has the power to vote. Everybody who can write and speak has the power to use their voice, either by pen or using their voice to speak up against it and to propose things that are better. So I'm not about always banning and these are bad and we need to get rid of this and get rid of that and ban everything. We also need to talk about what we can do. One of the best forces against illiberal anti-Americanism is civic pride. We can, just like the state of California was petitioned to make ethnic studies mandatory, we can do the same type of petition for civics that will actually fuel Americanism and pride in living in a liberal democratic republic. So there are things that we can do. I don't think it's just going to go away when the war ends. I think that if we just sit here and do nothing, we're going to see more of the same. That we have to participate in the democracy that we live in.
I guess I can. Might work.
There
we go. So, Nolan Finley, the editor of the Detroit News, was here a couple weeks ago, and he said the anti-Semitism is horrific, and he said the Jewish community needs to speak up because they're not speaking up. T.R. Carr, who spoke a moment ago, talked about, how do you influence the schools? And I and a few others have spoken to the public schools about literacy, and I can tell you that they don't seem to care. I've spoken, and several other people in this room have spoken to the University of Michigan over time, and it's like talking to the wall. And in both cases, going back to Nolan Finley, it appears that the problem is the community isn't behind us on the issues. In other words, the people who speak out aren't supported. What's your thoughts on how do we get support from the community?
There's that phrase that you need a seat at the table. There's also the idea that sometimes you have to build your own. So you build your own. You build new friends and partners. You build your own platform if the old platform isn't serving you well. And again, it's not something that's easy, especially if you're in an environment where the community isn't supportive. It takes a long time to community build, especially internally, because a lot of people get complacent and they're used to what was working before, thinking that it's going to continue to work. Changing that idea takes time, it takes effort, but it can be done. It's been done. It's one of the reasons why the founder, of our organization started the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. It hasn't been easy. It's been long going. Most people are like, oh, I've never heard of that organization. Of course, we're new and we're small, but we're still here. We're still working. We're still making, reaching out, and we are building community partners, and it does take time.
Thank you so much for being here. On a slightly different topic, can you comment on young Jewish anti-Zionists? And can you also speak a little bit about day school education and efforts to avoid creating future anti-Zionists?
I think that when anyone aligns themselves with an anti-Zionist movement as a Jew, it's really rooted in confusion and shame. And the counter to confusion and shame are knowledge and pride. The idea that Zionism and Jewishness could be separated is based on a pile of lies. The center of Jewishness is Israel. It is Zion. And if we're not teaching the next generation that, then it's easy for them to dismiss Israel and dismiss Zionism. And I speak about Zionism not as a political movement, but as sovereignty and peoplehood and connection to a land that a people came from and still hold the connection to. And what I often hear from a lot of Jewish and non-Jewish anti-Zionists is, well, I'm anti-Zionist because I don't like Bibi. And it's like that, well, you're displaying that either you're lying or you don't know what Zionism is. So here, let me tell you. And it's room for a conversation. There's also been, unfortunately, in Jewish education, a little bit of a misstep in actually educating Jews on Jewish peoplehood. There's been a lot of focus on DEI with non-Jewish communities, and not so much conversation and education around Jewish diversity. There are things we can do to address it. There are things that many people are doing to address it. I hope that we see more of that. But part of addressing that is maintaining the center of Jewishness, which is Israel.
If I can speak on that quickly too, I think we also do our kids a disservice when we don't give them honest and robust conversations about Israel and about anything while they're growing up. I think some of the things that we were talking about earlier is that we were talking about America and this idea of, no, of course there's broken parts of America and that there's parts of our history that have been shameful or bad because that's what countries are. But we sometimes grow up with myths of exceptionalism, whether it be American exceptionalism or whether it be painted myths of Israel that can be beautiful stories, but they also need nuance to be added onto them, because sometimes our kids grow up and they say, you lied to me about different things. And our role as educators and our roles as Jewish leaders is also to be able to talk to our kids and say, here are stories from different sides and from different people, and things are not always so clear, that there are nuances and that there are parts of conversation that we need to be able to have, rather than waking up one morning and being confronted with something that you were told was one thing your entire life and realizing that there's different parts of it and there's different shades of it. That can lead to pushback, emotional pushback that can be detrimental as well.
We got a couple extra brave people.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation. And I would just like to ask you something. I really don't need the microphone because I am loud, okay? I was a teacher, and teachers are loud. But the point I want to make is, do you think it would help? I'm also a grafted in one. I just came into this 9 years ago. I want to say, do you think it would help if Jewish people believe what the Torah says? The Jewish people are great people. If they would believe that, if they would understand who they are, they're about the last ones on this planet that has not been convinced that they're just roadkill, okay? Everyone else has decided, I am pitiful, I can't make it. But the Jewish people are God's best. Chosen. So who is it that can come tell you anything about who you are not, where you are not going, and what you will not have? I want to meet them, because the only one that can tell you that is your Creator. And I haven't seen him walking around amidst any of us to tell us such a thing. So what do you think? That's the question. What do you think?
It's what I said before. When we attach shame in who we are, it's easy to become victims and to try to shrink and make ourselves small as a people. I don't think that success should be something that we should be ashamed of. I don't think that maintaining a connection to peoplehood is something we should be ashamed of. It's the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and having this conversation. It was really inspiring to hear both of you speak. Dr. Shufutinsky, I have a quick question for you. So When you've had conversations with anti-Zionists, and especially anti-Zionist Jews, when you've gave them facts, have you ever seen them change their minds?
Great question.
I haven't been there for the mind change, but I'm holding on to hope that it's happened when I left.
Thank you. Everyone, one more round of applause for Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky.
Thank you.
And if I can leave us on one note, please. Here's the message that I also want to take us away with tonight, is that it is easy to sit in the background and to say, these people aren't doing this, these people don't get it, these people don't do this, my synagogue leadership doesn't do this, or Jewish professionals don't do this. Talk. Get out there, make your voice heard. I want to commend the individuals, again, not the groups, not the institution, not the organization, the individuals who made this evening possible tonight because they cared about this conversation. That is why we get together. That is how we improve as a people and as a society and as Jews. The one thing that we should always be doing is being in conversation with one another, even when it's uncomfortable, Dafka, when it's uncomfortable to have those conversations. That is what Jews do, and that is what makes us better. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our organizers tonight. Thank you to Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky. Everyone, please get home safe, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Erev Tov.
Thank you.